Hey guys, thanks for tuning into this inaugural edition of my new podcast series, Campaign Corner. It's going to be a venue for all things tabletop, a chance to hear about the RPGs that you've played with a different guest every episode. Today's adventurer is Robert Bushey. His campaign, The Night of Mausengart, recently wrapped after 1.5 years. He's here to tell us about his inspirations and aspirations from this original campaign setting. Hope you like it. Alright, Bushey. So, tell me about the Night of Mausengart. Tell me about the plane of Ur, the environment, the inhabitants. Let's start with the plane. What was the plane like?
Okay, so Ur is sort of like this plane that was inspired by a lot of kind of like Call of Cthulhu, a bunch of like the New Age fiction that's kind of like getting revisited. Call of Cthulhu with a big heavy emphasis on the pantheon of deities that exist. When I was playing 3rd edition and 3.5 edition of D&D, I bought a lot of the religion books, just kind of like to see how all these subsystems work together, because there was sort of an interest in there, because a lot of the flavoring of these kind of games, particularly in like Faerun and stuff like that, which is a big campaign setting I used to play, there's a huge emphasis on the deities and like the background setting for the game.
Right.
So, and for like a long time, I think since 2012, I was making a kind of like system to fit into Pathfinder, but of course I never really played that in Pathfinder.
I remember that.
I drafted up 12 gods, kind of
The
parallel
the
to
Dodecatheon, is that
yeah,
right?
to the Dodecatheon.
Yes.
To parallel sort of the feel that the Olympians had. The Olympians had 12. I kind of drafted them randomly, and then I kind of worked out on their portfolios that they got randomly rolled up, what they're the gods of. And I just went from there. And then I decided, oh, well, what if there were over-deities, and how would that fit in? Why aren't they more prevalent? And so I came up with the Titans, and so I was thinking also what kind of demigods would fit in there. And those gods are kind of like gods that reside on the planet. I wanted something modular for many different settings, and that's why I decided the Night of Mausengart would be the first setting that I go into there. Kind of like a post-apocalyptic feel to it. Because it's in style now.
Yes.
With sort of a Bloodborne, Dark Souls, like Castlevania type feel
Very
to it.
gothic, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to go for kind of like that Victorian Gothic feel. There's a lot of Plague Doctors kind of influence, but also like a bit of fallen Roman Empire kind of feel for it too. So I kind of like thatched this idea together from this comic that I read in the early 2000s, a comic about a vampire duo that save a small town in Kansas from a zombie apocalypse. And they are the only humans alive. And I just thought that was the most interesting idea, but it was just rather poorly delivered. So I was thinking, what if that was in a D&D setting? That would be absolutely fantastic.
Oh.
And so I absolutely ran with it. The last of the vampires sort of like culling off the rest of his kin and trying to nestle down with the last of humanity in one of the world's largest bastions against the hordes of rolling undead.
The city of Mausengart.
The city of Mausengart. There's like a lot of urban influence in there, but the wilds are just absolutely dangerous, even though they're right outside of the gates.
The Feywilds, that is, right?
Not just the Feywilds, but just going outside on the rolling fields. Supposed to have a lot of like zombie encounters as well, but once players learned fly, they went over them. That was kind of like the basis for Mausengart, kind of like a post-apocalyptic worst case scenario in case of a zombie apocalypse, while keeping it relatively fresh, trying to see what a nocturnal setting would be like.
So, Bushey, now that we know a little bit about the history behind Mausengart and what the environment was like, who were the people in Mausengart? What were the races around the world, and how did they worship?
The races around the world. I wanted Mausengart to be a port town, since it is right on the coast. Kind of like give people the ability to pick whatever kind of race that they would pick. Because ports, who knows what happened during the apocalypse? Who would have survived and who didn't? Of course, there's a local elf population, and that comes into effect very early on in the campaign.
Yep, a lot of racial prejudice.
Yeah, when the players have to end up saving all of the elves kind of like in the first kind of chapters in the game. Now, there's a couple of key characters that I set up to have an influence on the game and kind of like see where the players are heading, kind of like where they're directing the game. I made a couple of extra races as well because it is a dark world. The sun has disappeared from Earth. It is a plane without a sun. So I had to come up with a couple of extra key kind of features, a couple of extra characters that would have to improvise in this situation. There's a cult. It's led by the god of undeath, but instead of enslaving all of humanity like you think they would, they enslave them with indulgence. It's a land of suffering. And so the populace follows them out of a need to keep some semblance of hope, some semblance of sanity.
This being the Dark Lord Sabosius.
The Dark Lord Sabosius, yes. He's the god of death and...
The Tyrant.
The Tyrant, as he's called. Decadence. His temple is the most opulent building left in Mausengart. It is a grand temple that once used to have goodly port gods in it, but it's been taken over, and undead are churned out. These undead are like a sentient undead meant to bolster the power of the church, but also the population. They also churn out ghouls, which are like their slave faction of controlled like bodyguards and all sorts of military units. They can't afford to keep humans on the front lines, so this idea of one of the themes I wanted was taxation.
Yes.
That vampires have like this weird thing with feudalism that it's not going to be gold. There's no material possessions in the area for people to be taxed on, and so they are taxed on blood.
Yep.
They are taxed on their dead. They are limited to how many children they can birth in the city in order to keep them from overpopulating or underpopulating. Everything has to be controlled by these vampires and their Dhampir. I made the race called the Revelers, and Tybalt was a Reveler.
That was my character.
Yeah. The Revelers are a race of undead made by the Church of Sabosius, and they are kind of like jointly made with the Alchemist Guild. The Alchemist Guild are sponsored by an unusual deity known as the Apothecary, Dresdane. Dresdane is the god of medicine, he's the god of money and wealth, but he's also the god of transmutation and lycanthropy specifically. He's the god of all of this sort of exchange, and so he helps them create these walking cadavers. They get a second chance at life, kind of inspired from Frankenstein, like a Mary Shelley-esque, and this is kind of like how I wanted to add undead as a player race into the game without making them too overpowered, because undead are very different in every edition of D&D. Everyone wants to add the undead template onto things. Right. Yep. And undead are either incredibly underpowered, dissynchronous with the rest of the party because they get harmed by holy magic and stuff like that, which is used for healing. Yep. But in 5th edition, they give this really great opportunity. There's radiant necrotic damage, and those are damage spells, so they don't usually have to worry about that in the system. And I also made Dhampir as a race, which was played by one of the players in the party who made a maid.
Now, just to clarify, Revelers are a brand new creation by pretty much from scratch. Dhampirs are somewhat ported over from a previous version. They were a playable race in the earlier
Dhampirs are a playable race in Pathfinder and I think 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons as well.
Yeah.
Usually they have like a really negative affinity towards healing spells and such like that. Drain on the constitution.
Light vulnerability and all those things.
All those things. They're very difficult to play. But race in 5th edition is really kind of toned down, at least a little bit, so that it doesn't hamper the gameplay too terribly much, what you pick and how it affects your class.
We learned a little bit about the environment, the races, and some of the gods in Mausengart in the Land of Ur. Can you tell me anything about the Titans, who are sort of seen as the antagonists in your campaign, at least from the player's point of view?
From the player's point of view, they don't really come into play until the early chapter of the game, the first arc, where one of the players ended up worshipping one.
That was his patron.
That was his patron,
Yep.
one of the Titans, the Archon, which is kind of like this angelic one. Because none of the 12 really have the whole angel motif. The Titans, I decided, could be very extreme in their sort of portfolios. The 12 are kind of like the gods of mankind, so they each have like a purpose in society.
Mm-hmm.
However, the Titans are things that no longer exist in the world, and they don't really have a very strong affiliation with each other, in that they were banished from the realm by the 12 gods. They're kind of like the anti-gods. There's one Titan for every pairing in terms of their portfolio. There's this kind of motif that there are these strong chthonic creatures that live outside of their viewable universe, and that sometimes they leak in their influence because they're just so grand, magnificent in scale. And this was kind of like made to like add that little Greco-Roman influence into that. The Titans were defeated early on by the Olympians, particularly Zeus, and the Titans still have an influence in Greek mythology. However, they're outsiders for the most part, looking in Atlas, holding up the world.
In your case, there's the Void, who's literally outside the plane, holding it.
He's basically the night sky, and he ate the sun. Let's kind of like add that huge scale, that scope, that caused some of my players to kind of like bat an eye at just how do you fight something that large, or do you?
We joked that his portfolio was just size.
To create kind of like a conflict, the gods are meant to send their agents against other agents in their world to try and like increase their influence. Not only the Didaction against the Didaction, but also the Titans against them, in order to fight for their souls and just influence the plane in general.
So that's it for the setting of Mausengart. Now we're going to dig into a little bit of what the gameplay was like, how it might have differed because of Bushey's own personal homebrew from the normal kind of D20 system.
Okay, so this is a very expansive topic.
Yes. Yes, it is.
Because D&D 5th edition is very modular, and I tried to keep a lot of it very consistent. However, since we had many different arcs, and it was broken up by a lot of different people running, and that's called the troop system. We'll talk about that more in detail later. At the beginning, I had a system for wounds because I discovered that the short rest system and the long rest system were very lenient on health points. So I wanted to add a little bit of a twist to kind of like make combat a little bit more visceral. Depending on what kind of injury that your character received, you would receive a penalty to something, and also a penalty to your maximum health.
Can you give me an example of a type of wound that you would have assigned?
Yes. Well, Tybalt, I remember one of their times that they were hunting down a ghoul who had stolen one of the Lord's goblets that are supposed to keep the borders of the town safe from the outside and all the undead, because ghouls enjoy eating corpses. It was a very natural kind of selection that a necromancer such as Baron Gaspard would pick as sort of their vanguard. Now, he stole one of the goblets in order to liberate himself from the militia of ghouls. He ambushed the party, and one of the first people to get knocked unconscious was Tybalt.
I remember.
Tybalt had his throat ripped out by like the ghoul claws, and so for a while he was a little bit muted.
I was a bard at that point, so this was a death
pretty
blow.
Bad. There was like a whole game session where he couldn't really speak that well, and casting was very compromised by it. And this was on a randomly rolled table from physical wounds, kind of given a whole couple of tables based on what kind of damage it was, radiant ultimate and necrotic damage would have some sort of curse or a disease type effect, whereas the elemental ones would create a vulnerability to additional damage, as well as they fought a Medusa later on, and instead of having the Stone Gaze sort of as a compromise, they would gain stacks of brittle that were very easy to like acquire, but it would take a couple of stacks of this stuff, up to 5 stacks, each stack providing a benefit, kind of like an exponential growth of disability. They would eventually become paralyzed because their dexterity would reach 0 and they would petrify. I thought that was a very good kind of like transition for the system, and it showed a lot of promise. Of course, I messed around with very similar kind of things towards the end game when they were fighting gods and stronger bosses. They would apply kind of like buffs that would stack with their legendary resistances, and as their legendary resistance chopped off, they would gain less of these buffs, kind of like making the players feel like the progress is being made in the boss fight. Another big thing that I added to the game was social combat.
I was just about to ask you about social combat.
Social combat. It is a system that is in Pathfinder as one of their modular systems, but it is also in the Song of Ice and Fire. They had a very interesting system where it was very similar to AC, but kind of like a social AC and social hit points. And so I just kind of ran with that. The more socially apt your character was, and this is kind of going more towards rogues, you'd apply your charisma to your HP instead of that. It was very fiddly. And when I had an encounter with the Baron of the place, and I asked the players to roll initiative, they all gave me this terrible look. They were all 3rd level, that they were going to die immediately. But he had engaged them in a debate, and...
Not a fight.
Not a fight.
A debate.
A debate.
Yes.
And the players took to this really well, because they didn't get murdered by the Vampire Lord, but it still felt kind of active. They had to be on their feet, they had to come up with very clever attacks.
Counter-arguments, devil's advocates.
Yeah.
Roll for flattery.
Roll for flattery in order to lower his defenses and kind of like get in there and try and prove their point to him. And the players really loved that.
So you briefly mentioned a style of roleplay called troop style. Can you tell me in your terms what a troop style campaign is?
A troop style campaign is where you kind of play in the same world, the same setting. However, there is a round robin as to who the game master is. And this can be like a consecutive story or kind of done episodically where you switch off who is game mastering. And it's kind of like there can be some sort of agreement with it. In the Night of Mausengart, I was sort of the main dungeon master. I had like all of the canon kind of written down and kind of like the direction and where it was relatively heading, and to sort of alleviate that and to kind of like build excitement and momentum, I would have the dungeon master role go off to another player,
and you would become a player,
and I would become a player. And I had like a kind of personal note where I would usually play like a support character in the background.
So you were the main GM or DM, as you would say. Who followed after you?
After that, Alexandra picked up, and she's my roommate. She picked off at a point. They went to Nineveh, which is a kind of like an exotic port across the ocean,
a distant land. It was like a meanwhile,
where they had to deal with a crazy despot by the name of Melchior,
a cross-dressing lich.
Yes, a cross-dressing lich, a very eccentric lich. And one of the things about the lich is that the lich is one of the primal evils of the world that would kind of like prove to be one of the big bads, but also neutral.
Kind of like an anti-hero, almost.
Kind of like an anti-hero. The 3 primal evils are kind of anti-heroes, mostly antagonistic in nature. They all have something very weird about them that makes them unlike the rest of them. A severe quirk.
Yes.
And Melchior's was be a lich. Have no access to magic.
A magicless lich. And after Nineveh, it reverted back to you.
Yeah, it reverted back to me.
It formed this kind of pattern of Bushey, one of the players steps up, Bushey, one of the players steps up.
And the first arc of the game, before Nineveh, I had a very difficult time deciding where the stopping point would be. But I think 3 weeks in, I was like, I think they're going to conflict with the Baron.
Yes.
The Baron Vampire. Once the game did that, I broke away and I gave permissions to the new GM. Hands off what the rest of the world is sort of like, but here's some free range that you can mess around with.
Now, after Nineveh, there was briefly a time loop arc, put in layperson's terms to like a Majora's Mask.
A Groundhog Day kind
Yes,
of
exactly.
arc. I really wanted to mess around with something like that.
And after this, Owen was actually the next DM. He had a brief arc.
Yeah, he had a brief arc, which was kind of a quirky little Fey arc that involved a lot of very kaiju big battle, a lot of purple worms, and those are fun encounters for a party of that size to fight. A lot of purple worms, a lot of interesting mystery, and it was wrapped off with their first god fight. Big casualties in that fight.
I definitely recall.
It was the god of rebirth, as he was currently rebirthing in their sacred forest where the elves had originated from. He had turned into a zombified form of his previous self. Kind of like a
very
Earthbound Mother giant.
Very Gygas in influence.
Yeah.
If you haven't played Earthbound, check it out. So following this,
following that, I think
there was a construction or like a rebuilding arc.
I was a DM again. I went with a very rules light version of the kingdom building rules to kind of like sort everything out. And after that, I believe it was your campaign that you took over.
Yes, the Muslims and Dragons, which there's a previous campaign corner about. So any interest, you can definitely check that out. How did it look from your perspective, Bushey? Hearing your side, how did that arc that I DM'd, how did that kind of fit as a piece of the puzzle into the broader world of Ur?
I believe it was an area farther away, like the far west.
Zagros.
Yes.
The Middle East.
The Middle East of the
quote,
world.
unquote.
And the last of the three primal evils were there, kind of biding their time, building wealth and resources to kind of shore up his control and fight off the Titans. And kind of, this was the arc where the Titans were really kind of like amped up because they were going to that fourth tier of play, the godlike legendary tier, to kind of like build that up and work towards it. Very difficult. The players really kind of struggled to go through it.
It was very combat intensive.
Very combat intensive.
And this dovetailed nicely into certain entities in your game that were notably absent from different lands. So we were able to focus on, like you said, some primal evils, some titans, some members of the Dodecatheon that were considered like long gone or long forgotten. We focused on a titan called the Hound. We focused on a battle god from the Dodecatheon called the Harbinger, who I unilaterally decided had a Macho Man Randy Savage style voice. And I don't think I wrote that in the last one, but I'll tell you guys that the reason I did that is because I knew that now that stuck, Bushey now had to do that voice anytime he role played the Harbinger. And it was absolutely wonderful. And then after that arc, it went back to what would be the finale, the conclusion of Mausengart.
Yeah, so I traded my game off 3 times, and each time there was a interesting little addition added to the canon of the world. It's very difficult to create a world all by yourself, but I'm always a proponent of having your players have some sort of say in it. It adds a little bit of extra investment, and it adds a lightening to the burden that you have to do as a content creator.
Up next, we're going to talk about what you might consider were the weakest parts of your game, either from your own perspective or player feedback over time, what you think some of your greatest misses were.
Okay, to put it lightly, I hate high-level games. Once any game reaches beyond 15th level, I will absolutely lose interest in auditing these scrolls of character sheets and items that people carry. And unless it's absolutely ridiculous, I will never audit their character sheet. And I keep kicking myself for it, but I just don't have 4 hours to do fantasy taxes. And it became rough because I quickly learned that if I don't write it down in the main tome that I have, sometimes they get lost. And there was a lot of items that I had people spend resources on to make that might have gotten lost and might have exclusively been on their character.
So we're talking about inventory management.
Inventory management.
Yes.
No one likes running a fantasy quartermaster management thing. I believe one of the hardest parts of the game also was the kingdom maker aspect of the game. Kingdom management, where people had to manage their funds.
Their finances.
We
had to do a lot of hiring.
Yep. HR, which is an aspect of D&D First Edition that was missing from 5th Edition. And there's not a lot of use for gold in 5th Edition either, which is very sad. Said, forget about it. Throw gold out. This is the new currency. These divine points, these build points to make items. And that sort of worked for a bit. It's a system that I think was very good in theory. However, I'm going from Pathfinder, which had a very utilitarian kind of like table, and like you could go through it with like a fine-tooth comb and kind of like pick the stuff you want to make custom magic items.
So that was one aspect of your design process. Were there any frequent criticisms that you got from your players that you considered a weakness of your DMing style?
I think that sometimes I would pigeonhole myself into only building enough stuff for a very certain amount of counters, but sometimes they take a social route out and
a diplomacy versus
combat route, or sometimes they negotiate, they trade away like valuable magic items for a certain result. I'm looking at their rolls, I'm looking at their bargaining chips, and there goes my stuff for tonight, and just play poker face while I literally watched my game spiral out of control for the evening.
So the last topic I have prepared is, what do you consider the strongest parts of your game?
I think the early starts of low-level play were done quite well. Sort of the thing I look forward to, because in a dark gothic setting, you kind of want that edge, that dirt, the grime. I tried to have a very nice dichotomy of that doom and that levity that comes with the setting. Sabazius is a dark god who will bring about the end of times, but he is also the god of decadence, orgies, and such. So his grand temple is an absolute zoo, and even like the most evil of his clerics have unusual quirks and such.
They're wielding like dildos and stuff.
There's
literally
a lot of adult humor that could be added into it that really added to it, but there's also kind of like a grittiness because some of their inner sanctums have like living walls made of like zombified flesh. And I think a lot of this imagery kind of stuck with some of my players. I keep hearing things on occasion about how just certain descriptions kind of like sink in your head, and just kind of like the world building in general, how the mental exercises of how do these people live day per day, and just like the encounters whenever players get that whole I can't believe we survived that feeling of we survived, just to
like a
line
boss
up
fight
with that theme. Well, yes, like a boss fight, like an encounter with zombies, or negotiations with the Baron, several of the investigation type things that went down, just like a sort of medley of things, just trying to keep it dark but also accentuate certain areas with bits of light and levity. Overall, I think my players enjoyed it, which is ultimately what I really wanted out of it, to have people kind of like delve into that kind of like grit and the gothic themes of it. And I picked a player base that I knew would kind of enjoy some of the spooky bits, although I know you didn't enjoy some of the spooky bits with the ghosts.
I'm just a very faint of heart person. That's all.
And like the skeletons and Thieves Guild there, I knew people would enjoy bits with that. It wasn't exactly like an encounter that it didn't end in violence. It was gambling with a bunch of skeleton bros in a warehouse. I remember that scene. That people seem to something like that one, I think. Just kind of like the resolution in D&D of things. I kind of borrowed this from Undertale. Just like resolving combat in ways, or having different forms of combat, or conflict resolution with things other than combat.
That was outside of the box.
Outside of the box. Because ultimately, we're role-playing.
So I want to do something a little bit different for this segment. In Bushey discussing what he considers the strongest parts of his game, in another segment, there was a god that was rebirthing himself. That was the Spore, I believe, right? That boss fight when we were about level 12, 13, something like that.
Yeah, I think it was 12 or 13.
That was one of the most memorable combat instances, at least to me, in probably the entire game. It was at a time where in 5e, all of our proficiencies had just reached the next level. We had started getting like iterative attacks, unlocking really like near like the capstone area abilities. And at this point, the party was Tybalt the Mystic, Hanzo the Archer, Celine the Cleric, and Odwin the Druid. And one by one, we really started slowly getting picked off. It was one of those fights where the enemy decided to go after the healers first, and it worked. And we jumped into stopping that a little bit too late. So at the end of it, we were left with just ranged characters. I believe it was Tybalt and Hanzo. And I mean, the healers had done their best to identify the boss and figure out, how they could escape safely. We were in some kind of like abandoned cathedral, I believe, or like a temple.
I think it was a temple warren. It was a temple warren, so the entire thing was kind of like a one way in kind of deal, and it was being protected previously by a dragon.
That's right, a forest dragon.
A forest dragon whose corpse was blocking the way in.
It was that big.
Yeah.
And one of the only weaknesses of this spore fetus like Gygus Earthbound style boss was that it was effectively immobile. It was very slow. It wouldn't really pursue us, but it also wouldn't let us leave.
Yes. It was bound to the well, a well of power.
A rune well.
Yeah.
Almost like by a cosmic umbilical cord. That's the vibe that I got.
Yeah.
Now, this is the level where Hanzo had gotten, I believe, some form of like a lightning shot. Like some kind of like a multi-attack. And Tybalt had recently gotten, as a mystic, a psionic art that lets you reduce your own current and maximum HP in order to unlock more psi points, which is basically what you spend on all of your abilities. And I recall that Bushey started throwing out really just monstrous deck saves of energy blasts. They would really just end you in one, maybe two hits if you're lucky.
Yeah.
And Tybalt had just used something like an ultimate attack, very Dragon Ball Z-esque, something like a Kamehameha, and I had flavored it that because my psi points hit 0, that I actually burnt my left arm to a crisp, and then my arms were practically functionally useless. Hanzo at this point had ducked back and was at a safe distance. Tybalt was not. Somehow, some way, the next energy blast that the spore released, I rolled a natural 20. Now, Tybalt has his back to the wall. He has no use of his arms. I like to pantomime it. I actually got up and I role-played that Tybalt uses all of the rest of his remaining stamina to shift and turn and hit the wall, turning, 180 degrees very, very slowly, and that the lightning hit the exact spot 2 inches to his left.
Just frying the wall.
Oh, the wall was completely disintegrated. And at that point, Tybalt had to really, he was out of attacks, without psi points. He dipped into that kind of dark psionic art. I forget what that feature is exactly called, but I was able to, almost like a My Hero Academia sense. It's like, you're destroying your body, you have no attacks left. Your only option is to destroy your body some more.
Yeah,
and I had
deteriorate your health.
Exactly.
Try and put that last stand in, the last effort.
That's right.
To try and desperately kill what you're trying to, your quarry. Yeah.
And that's exactly what I did. I poured the rest of my health into that attack, and then after that, after the next attack, which I believe the spore still did not die, I retreated into a tunnel, and I let Hanzo dance around and pick off the spore with its remaining health.
This was like the one instance where the players, I thought, we're gonna die.
I really thought it was a
They put
TPK.
all of their eggs in exactly one basket.
Yes.
Poured all of their resources, and this was after a couple of encounters as well. They'd already fought a giant tree undead thing.
Yep.
As well.
The Hanzo's family tree.
Family tree.
Pun intended. It was literally made out of Hanzo's family.
Hanzo's family.
Son of a bitch.
It was a fun dungeon. An outdoor dungeon.
Yes. That fight, I hope you would agree, was one of the most anime in scale.
Yeah.
Yeah. It ended pretty much right before our lives did. That's the best way I can put it. Your game ran for 1.5 years, which is very, very impressive in and of itself. Do you have any final thoughts on Mausengart?
This is the one campaign game that lasted a real good time from start to finish. Although I do have to say, the takeaway message is you don't have to go from 1 to 20 to kind of make a game really last. And some players, some DMs just have like that sweet spot where their abilities kind of like go the best. I believe I will try to make this my setting, my go-to setting for when in the future I have a hankering for D&D. I'm not sure if I'll ever run the whole campaign in tandem, but I might modulate or kind of like write down certain bits of it for other people to kind of take away. Things I would probably do in the future, I think I might keep it low level because I think that was sort of the sweet spot that I really enjoyed.
So you're thinking about creating basically a campaign template that you could rerun parts of this again.
Yeah, kind of like rerun parts of it again, or have other people kind of reference to have kind of like a baker's recipe or something like that.
I definitely feel like the Night of Mausengart was really meant to be a 5th edition game. That I don't think it would be as compatible with, for example, like a Pathfinder or an older edition of D&D.
Yeah, but that's the thing. If I did make a Pathfinder type game for this, it would be very different.
It would need to be.
It would, but it was originally made for Pathfinder. So I think since 5th edition is so rules light and very heavy on the role playing, that if it was modified for Pathfinder, it would be very gamey and very beat 'em up, very combat heavy. Also, another change I might do is this one's a little bit controversial. I might do like a bit of a Arrested Development type alternative to character creation.
You mean in that your game is going to be canceled and then Netflix is going to have to pick up the rest of the series?
Yeah. And that the classes would have a level cap. It would really change things up. I was thinking about it. You would have like a 5th or 6th level cap, and then once you reach that cap, I know a lot of people run the tier 5 system or something, where the maximum level in their game is 5th level.
Really, no?
You didn't know about that?
No.
But like a king or an emperor, he would be 5th level. The highest, like Heroes of the Realm would be 5th level. And it would be very much like a Lord of the Rings style, Game of Thrones style, kind of like adventure, where there's high fatalism and high fatality, high danger type game.
High fatalism and high feudalism.
Yes. However, I think I would modify it. Whenever you reach 6th level and you'd still gain experience points, they would be forced to multi-class. And then after that, you just use Gestalt rules.
Which is where you play 2 classes at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Keeps a lot of the high magic out. Keeps a lot of the broken, very high level features out. Although it would go at risk of everyone having a high level character that will do much of the same thing, all jack of all trade characters. I think it shows some promise. I might do that next time.
I'm definitely curious to see where it goes.
Yeah.
Alright guys, that's it for this edition of Campaign Corner. See you on the next one. Thanks for listening.